Hello, everyone. My name is John Sierra, and I'm a Tolkien scholar. And what that essentially means is that I can answer questions about J.R.R. Tolkien. For the practical purposes, what it really means is that I've studied the works of J.R.R. Tolkien for a really long time, the majority of my adult life. And so if you have any sort of question for me, I'm the guy that you can come to that will give you a thoughtful, well-reasoned, and well-researched answer. And I'm also the guy that will tell you when there really isn't an answer. I feel like there's a lot of people out there who want to answer every question, which is very noble, but sometimes there are things we're not meant to know, and we could make strong surmise, but we can't give a definitive answer. Anyway, I'm going to try to get through this in an expeditious manner today. The video is still going to be probably as long as it usually is, but I'm going to try my best to not sort of bluster on for too long, because I'm not feeling all that great today. Just a little bit of like a stomach issue, nothing gross, just kind of just painful, really. But anyway, like the video, leave me a comment, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and if you're thinking, well, that's awfully presumptuous of you, I'll ask again at the end of the video. That way, if you make it all the way there, well, then at that point you really should subscribe, don't you think? If you want to leave me a question, you can just leave a comment. As a matter of fact, everybody that's watching this video who is interested in my content, I'm urging you to leave a comment, even if you don't have a question, even if you're just saying hi or whatever, because it helps fuel the algorithm and make sure that the video is shown to more people. If you hit the like button and you happen to see a hype button, also hit that, because that helps me out as well. Not everybody will see that. It's sort of like a really weird thing that happens when a video first is put up, but either way, that's the way that goes. Anyway, if you want to ask me a question, you can in the comments, and I'll answer you in the comments. If you want to be featured in a video, and keep in mind there is a bit of a waiting list. I'm still trying to get my backlog of questions, through there. I'm still answering stuff from October at this point. I think we finished out stuff from September. There might be one or two from September, because some people ask a lot of questions, which is perfectly fine, but I don't want to have a video where it's all one person, so I try to stagger it, But you could ask me a question two ways. You can do it through a website called Quora. Quora is a knowledge-sharing platform where you can ask any sort of question and have people with relevant knowledge or experience or wisdom or education answer you. And if you ask any sort of question about Tolkien, about the Lord of the Rings, the Silmarillion, the Hobbit, or whatever, on there, you'll see a list of names of people that you can specify that you would like to ask them that question. And my name will be at or near the top of that list, so just click on me there. There's a link to my Quora in the description. You could also do it through YouTube, though you have to use the mobile app. A little video will pop up showing you how to do it on your mobile YouTube. You just go to my channel, click on view the community, and then click on posts, and you can make a post there. If your post gets removed, it's because I'm just cleaning house, meaning that I am answering you. If I reply to you with an answer, it just means that it was something that could just very quickly be answered and wasn't really, for a video. But we do have 10 questions to get through today, and we have a reading, and I'm going to read you from one of my very favorite Tolkien stories, if not the very, favorite of them, which is the Children of Húrin. And this was originally published sort of piecemeal. There were bits of it in the Silmarillion, but most of it was actually published in Unfinished Tales. And you would sort of read through the beginning part in Unfinished Tales, and then it would direct you which pages of the Silmarillion to read, and then to return to Unfinished Tales. And even then, you were still only getting most of it, not quite all of it. They did edit together a wonderful novel form of the Children of Húrin, which is pretty as complete as the story's ever going to get, And I thought it would be good to read a little bit from Chapter 8, which is called The Land of Bow and Helm. So let's read a bit of that. In the days that followed, Beleg labored much for the good of the company. Those that were hurt or sick he tended, and they were quickly healed, for in those days the Grey Elves were still a high people, possessing great power, and they were wise in the ways of life and of all living things. And though they were less in crafts and lore than the exiles from Valinor, they had many arts beyond the reach of men. Moreover, Beleg the archer was great among the people of Doriath. He was strong and enduring, and far-sighted in mind as well as eye, and at need he was valiant in battle, relying not only upon the swift arrows of his long bow, but also upon his great sword Anglachel. And ever the more did his hatred grow in the heart of Mim, who hated all elves, as has been told, and who looked with a jealous eye on the love that Turin bore to Beleg. When winters passed and the stirring came, and the spring, the outlaws soon had sterner work to do. Morgoth's might was moved, and the long fingers of a groping hand, the forerunners of his armies, probed the ways into Beleriand. Who knows now the counsels of Morgoth? Who can measure the reach of his thought, who had been Melkor, mighty among the Ainur of the great song, and sat now, the Dark Lord, upon a dark throne in the north, weighing in his malice all the tidings that came to him, whether by spy or by traitor, seeing in the eyes of his mind and understanding far more of the deeds and purposes of his enemies than even the wisest of them feared, save Melian the Queen. To her often his thought reached out, and there was foiled. In this year, therefore, he turned his malice towards the lands west of Sirion, where there was still power to oppose him. Gondolin still stood, but it was hidden. Doriath he knew, but could not enter yet. Further still lay Nargothrond, to which none of his servants had yet found the way, a name of fear to them. There the people of Finrod dwelt in hidden strength, and far away from the south, beyond the white woods of the birches of Nimbrathil, from the coast of Avernian and the mouths of Sirion, came rumour of the havens of the ships. Thither he could not reach until all else had fallen. So now the orcs came down out of the north in ever greater numbers. Through Anach they came, and Dimbar was taken, and all the north marches of Doriath were infested. Down the ancient road they came, that led through the long defile of Sirion, past the isle where Minas Tirith of Finrod had stood, and so through the land between Malduin and Sirion, and then on through the eaves of Brethil to the crossings of Taglin. Thence of old the road passed on to the guarded plain, and then along the feet of the highlands watched over by Aemon Ruth. It came down into the vale of Narog, and came at last to Nargothrond. But the orcs did not go far upon that road as yet, for there dwelt now in the wild a terror that was hidden, and upon the red hill were watchful eyes of which they had not yet been warned. In that spring Turin put on again the helm of Hador, and Beleg was glad. At first their company had less than 50 men, but the woodcraft of Beleg and the valour of Turin made them seem to their enemies as a host. The scouts of the orcs were hunted, their camps were espied, and if they gathered to march in force in some narrow place out of the rocks, or from the shadow of the trees, there leapt the dragon helm and his men, tall and fierce. Soon at the very sound of his horn in the hills their captains would quail, and the orcs would turn to flight before any arrow whined or sword was drawn. It has been told that when Mim surrendered his hidden dwelling on Aemon Ruth to Turin and his company, he demanded that he who loosed the arrow that slew his son should break his bow and his arrows and lay them at the feet of Kim, and that man was Androg. Then with great ill will Androg did as Mim bade. Moreover, Mim declared that Androg must never again bear bow and arrow, and he laid a curse on him that if nevertheless he should do so, then he would meet his own death by that means. Now in the spring of that year Androg defied the curse of Mim, and took up a bow again in a foray from Baron Dwanwith, and in that foray he was struck by a poisoned orc arrow, and was brought back dying in pain. But Beleg healed him of his wound, and now the hatred that Mim bore to Beleg was increased still more, for he had thus undone his curse, but it will bite again, he said. That's a good place to stop, I think. Otherwise I'll just keep going and, read the whole chapter, and we can't have that, because then the video would be very long, and like I said, I'm not feeling amazingly well. So anyway, some really interesting stuff. You hear mention of a Minas Tirith. Of course, this is not the same Minas Tirith that was in Gondor later. That was actually named after this, because really Minas is tower, and Tirith is to guard, so it is the tower of the guard. And the city in Gondor was actually originally called Minas Anor, which is the Tower of the Sun, and it was also sort of named after Anarion, which was Elendil the High King's second son. And of course there was Minas Ithil, which was the Tower of the Moon, also somewhat named after Isildur, because you have to remember, in Cinder and Elvish, the TH sound and the S sound are actually sort of the same thing. There was, of course, the Shibboleth of Fëanor, where he felt that, it shouldn't have ever been changed. And people make some rather amusing memes about that, like, oh, Fëanor had a lisp, and so everybody had to change it. But really, it was about the way that his mother's name sounded, when it was done in sort of the new way, and he didn't like the way that it sounded, and he was really very fond of his mother. So of course Minas Tirith in this case is Finrod's city, not of course Anarion's city, which later became the seat of the kings of Gondor after it was Minas Tirith, and of course Minas Ithil became Minas Morgul because it fell into the hands of the enemies. We also hear a bit of Mim at the end. Mim is a petty dwarf. The petty dwarves were sort of like, in the early dwarves, the dwarves are generally called the Naugrim. That's what the elves refer to them as, the Naugrim. But there were some that were exiled out of the Naugrim, either because they were just really, really unpleasant, or they were criminals and such, and they became known as the petty dwarves. And at this point in the story, there really aren't that many of the petty dwarves left. And Mim actually winds up being one of the very last of the petty dwarves, and he had several children, one of which was Kim, who was slain, in sort of a moment of rashness by Andrag. And of course, it's sort of like Mim is not a pleasant person. You can sort of tell why the dwarves didn't want to deal with him and why he was kicked out of their society. He's very, very unpleasant. He hates all the elves. He wants to put curses on people, and he does that quite often. Or curses on objects. He does that too with the Treasure of Nagathron. But what's really interesting is that the book Children of Húrin doesn't actually explain what happens to Mim. You have to read actually two other books to find out the pieces there. One of them is The Shaping of Middle-earth. The other is The Shaping of Middle-earth tells you where he goes, where they tell you how he gets killed, which is by Húrin, actually. Was the War of the Jewels actually tells you that. So, Mim is very unpleasant, but he kind of gets a raw deal here because he's just gathering some roots and stuff like that, and then all of a sudden these men are upon him, and his son is laying there dead, and he's trying to heal him, but these men are tying him up, and then it's too late, and then they sort of just forcibly move into his house and take him for ransom, and they live there, and he hates them, obviously, but now he has to deal with them. He kind of likes Turin, but his hatred wins out in the end, and that's why he betrays Turin. And of course, Turin's father, is at this point sitting on the side of a mountain in a chair, while Morgoth forces him to watch all the terrible things that are happening to his children. And Morgoth is very selective about what he lets Húrin see. So Húrin sees the good moments sort of between Turin and Mim, where they kind of seem like they're friends, and then the moment where Mim betrays him. And so, of course, Húrin is thinking, I have to get revenge on this dwarf, and he eventually kills him. But he didn't know all of the terrible things that Turin and his company did to Mim and his family, so he was only seeing part of it, So it's sort of really interesting. People who say, oh, well, Tolkien stuff is too morally black and white. There's no shades of gray. There's no moral ambiguity. Read The Children of Húrin. That's the sort of story you're going to like. And by the way, it's not my favorite because it has moral ambiguity and because it has some gray morality in it and because there are very flawed characters. Even the very best characters are somewhat flawed in this. That's not why. It really is just because it's a great, great story, and I'm kind of a sucker for tragedies, and this is one of the most tragic tales that Tolkien ever told. The Fall of Gondolin also is really up there. And I have, let's see, this version here of The Fall of Gondolin, and this pretty much gives you like every version of the story, but the one that's really good in this is called the last version, which is unfortunately completely unfinished, but it's very, very detailed and very well written. It's definitely Tolkien's best writing. It's unfortunate that he didn't get far in actually writing that. He was doing it in sort of the style of The Lord of the Rings and the Children of Húrin, but even more so because it was towards the end of his life and he had really, really honed his craft, and unfortunately he died before he got very far with that final version of the Fall of Gondolin, which is also an unfinished tales, where it's called of I don't know why I'm blanking on the title. It was of Turin is coming to Gondolin, because that's really the part of the story that got written. The actual fall of Gondolin part he didn't get to. He just, it sort of ends with Turin arriving at the city. But anyway, I said I wasn't going to blather on too much, and here I am blathering on too much. So let's get to your first question. Our first question comes in by the request of Link of Wise, who asks, why did Mairon stop getting called Gorthaur and only was called Sauron after a certain point? I think this is a really good question because, you know Sauron from The Lord of the Rings, and we learn when we read the Silmarillion that he had other names, and that we don't learn about Mairon, but we learned about Gorthaur. He's called Sauron the Abhorred, or also Gorthaur the Cruel, but at some point, that name disappears. It's not in The Lord of the Rings. And actually, I would say that the sort of seminal moment that stopped people from calling him that, Gorthaur the Cruel, was actually the Fall of Doriath. So the name Gorthaur the Cruel is mentioned a few times in the Silmarillion, and in the War of the Jewels, you get the sort of etymological evolution of how the name came about. But there's no doubting the simple fact that the being, the fallen angel who had previously been called Mairon, was mostly called Sauron by the elves, and the men and the other free peoples of Middle-earth. Even within the Silmarillion, which is the book that features the most Sauron, except for maybe the collected version of Beren and Lúthien, I checked. I have digital copies of all these books, and I ran these names through, a search to see how many times they came up. And the name Sauron is mentioned 200 times, over 200 times, in the Silmarillion, and Gorthaur comes up 7 times. And Mairon is not mentioned at all because that was actually revealed later in a very obscure place. It was the 17th issue of a language journal called Parma Eldalamberon, and that's where Tolkien mentions that Sauron's original name was Mairon the Admirable. But anyway, if we look at just like the Third Age works, in The Hobbit, he's not mentioned by name. They just call him the Necromancer. Although some of the early versions of The Hobbit, the early drafts, made it more clear who he was. But at that point, they were calling him Thu, not Gorthaur or Sauron. And Thu is actually where the name Gorthaur comes from. In The Lord of the Rings, they mostly call him Sauron, but sometimes they're just calling him the Dark Lord, or Boromir straight up calls him him that we do not name. So while Gorthaur is, sort of put out as this alternate name for Sauron, why did he just stop being, called that? Why did it stop being used? Well, that's likely tied into the Fall of Doriath. Sauron as a moniker is in the Quenya language, and Gorthaur is Sindarin, and they don't mean the same thing, but it's just important to mention that they are in different languages, and Sindarin would be spoken a lot in the Third Age, of course, so you would think, well, there'll be some elves that'll call him Gorthaur, but not really. There weren't a lot of Noldor left in Middle-earth at that time that were speaking Quenya. And even, the Mannish nations like Gondor spoke Sindarin, or at least a dialect of Sindarin. The fact that Gorthaur is mentioned so seldom, even in the Silmarillion, is that it just wasn't very popular as a moniker even then. So in the Rings of Power, which the in-universe author, which is probably Elrond, mentions the name Gorthaur in passing, and he just says it was used by the Sindar in Beleriand. And obviously Beleriand is gone, but you may wonder why the refugees of Beleriand who stayed in Middle-earth didn't continue to use that name. Well, the insistence of the Grey Elves, the Sindar, of Beleriand on not using the name Sauron is chalked up to the fact that their king, Eleuthingel, was so scandalized by the actions of the Fëanorians that he actually banned the speaking of the Quenya language in his realm. So a lot of the Noldor who came to Middle-earth who weren't mass murderers, they were welcome in his realm, such as Galadriel, and they were perfectly happy to learn Sindarin, even if they did think that Quenya was a better language. When Thingol died, there was not really a Doriath for all that much longer. The Queen Melian passed to the west, likely to reunite with her husband, and their sole child Lúthien had become mortal, and she in fact died the same year that her father did. Lúthien's son Dior briefly became the king of Doriath, but the kingdom had its final fall just like 3 years later, when the Fëanorians came in and they just sort of mopped up what was left. Even if the elves weren't slaughtered and scattered, and Dior's sons, they went missing and they were believed killed, Dior's daughter Elwing wouldn't have much left to rule at that point if the Sindar would have even wanted to have a woman as their ruler. Most of the Sindar either wound up in the west, or they migrated to the east of Middle-earth, and they integrated themselves culturally with the Sylvan elves. And most notably of these, you would have characters like Orifur, who established the Woodland Realm in Greenwood the Great, which was later called Mirkwood, and of course Celeborn, who with his wife Galadriel, they didn't really have a kingdom, but they became the Lord and Lady of Lothlorien after the passing of King Amroth. So the Grey Elves had this great diaspora, and they mostly integrated into the Sylvan elf culture. They would adopt the more common name, which was Sauron, and then, everyone else in Middle-earth was calling him that, So there's Gorthaur, which was really, something that was used by a very specific sect of elves because they weren't allowed to speak Quenya, and Thingol wasn't around telling them what languages they could speak. So, and they were no longer associating the Quenya language with Fëanor because he's gone as well. So there you have it. All right, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in by the request of Gary Welsh, who asks, did Tolkien originally think of Gandalf as a human wizard? Now, this is a really, really interesting question because it's complicated. While Gandalf's status as an angelic being was hinted at in The Lord of the Rings, and then there were later works, The Silmarillion and Unfinished Tales, that would cement it. No, actually, Gandalf was never intended to be human. The concept of the Ainur had existed in every version of Tolkien's Legendarium, even going back to the very first drafts, far before he came up with the word Ainu, and at that point the Valar were called the gods, and the other the other angels were called spirits and sprites and sylphs and dryads and mermaids, and the mermaids and the sprites and the sylphs and all that were all dropped from the story eventually. The gods became the Valar and the spirits became the Maiar. So still the Hobbit was sort of existing in its own bubble for the most part, right? Yes and no, not really. I mean, Tolkien intended it to be a standalone story that would sort of sit on its own, but he certainly put a lot of Silmarillion stuff in The Hobbit. We could see this with Bilbo's description of how the Wood Elves differ from the High Elves, and he even calls the three kinds of High Elves the Deep Elves, the Sea Elves, and the Light Elves. That would be the Noldor, the Falmari, and the Vanyar. And Sauron is in The Hobbit too. I mean, he's mentioned, the Necromancer. We talked about that in the last question. In the published version, and in the earlier drafts, it was all more obviously Sauron, who at the time was sort of a composite of these earlier characters, Thu and Tevildo. Elrond is in it. That's sort of the biggest connection to the Silmarillion that was in The Hobbit. So, it stands alone, but it is connected. So, let's talk about Gandalf. He was first presented as a wizard named Bladderthin in the very earliest drafts, which is very similar to Bladoriand, which was an earlier name of the land of Beleriand, which interestingly enough could be, and this is interesting because we talked about the whole bladder thing last week, but if you take Bladorian and you Quenyize it, you could get Palarcindo, which is very similar to Palasendo, which was a name that was used for one of the Blue Wizards. But the character was just never intended to be human, I don't think. The only leap from Bladderthin to Gandalf is just the name has changed. There was a Gandalf in the early draft. It was a dwarf, and then they named that dwarf Thorin Oakenshield. The inspiration was once said to come from this mountain spirit postcard that Tolkien had, though it is actually in dispute when he got that postcard. He may have already come up with Bladderthin, and he may have even been named Gandalf already by the time that Tolkien got that postcard. We're really not sure how long he had it, because there's sort of two accounts of it. But the actual inspiration was always Odin in his wanderer guise. Tolkien, in letter 107, which was written in 1946, he complained about the failures of this proposed German translation of The Hobbit, and he mentioned that he didn't like the illustrations especially and how Disney-fied the drawings were, mentioning that they depicted Gandalf as this figure of vulgar fun rather than the Odinic wanderer that I think of. So while the term Maya was not around yet, it's clear one way or another that he never saw Gandalf as human, but rather as a spirit of some sort, visually inspired by Odin the Wanderer. Even the name Gandalf means elf of the wand, and that doesn't point to a mortal at all, and not even to the elves, as in Tolkien's elves, but the Germanic elves, the spirits that Tolkien was familiar with. So the name was actually derived from Gandalfir, which appeared in the Prophecy of the Seeress, which was a volume of the Poetic Edda. And the character in that work of Gandalfir was described as a dwarf. But the linguistics come from Gandir, which is wand, and Alf, which is elf, which an elf to the Germanic peoples of that time was a protective spirit. So it's perhaps because of the spirit name that he swapped the name away from a dwarf and gave it to a wizard, and shifted the name of Bladderthin to this king that had died years ago. So there you have it. All right, let's move on to the next question. Our next question came in by the request of Rico Thingo, who asks, why did Tolkien refer to Italy as his Gondor? He didn't refer to it as his Gondor. It was just Gondor. As far as he was concerned, Italy and Gondor were the same thing. If you line up a map of Europe in a proper fashion with a map of Middle-earth's northwest regions, which I have on the screen now, it's very illuminating. Now, the proper way to line this up, because I've seen people get it wrong, is to, that the Shire should be England, and specifically Hobbiton, which is in the West Farthing, which is where Bilbo lived and later Frodo and Sam, that should line up with Tolkien's home in Oxford. Then you can see that Gondor is Italy, and it wasn't just about Gondor being where Italy is on the map, though. Italy was, this remnant of the Roman Empire, much the way that Gondor was a remnant of Numenor. Numenor doesn't really have a lot in common with Rome, but it has more in common with the mythical Atlantis. But still, it has that whole remnant of a great fallen nation in there. One of the main examples of Tolkien referring to Italy as Gondor was in letter 168, where he was giving the excuse of a late reply to Mr. Richard Jeffrey, and he stated that Jeffrey's letter came to him while I was away in Gondor, and then in parentheses he says Venice, stating that as a change from the North Kingdom, of course recognizing England as part of Arnor. One could say that Venice is somewhat like where Amon Hen is, based on where it is on the map to the north of Ravenna, which Ravenna is the city that inspired Minas Tirith, not the first age Minas Tirith that we talked about earlier, though Osgiliath was actually the Gondorian city that was built on water, so that's probably more in common with Venice. Of course, with all of this in mind, the distance involved in The Lord of the Rings makes more sense to some people, because some people think, well, it doesn't really look that far on the map, because they don't really have a sense of scale. So Frodo essentially is walking, at least most of the way, he's walking from Oxford to approximately around Sarajevo. Though, of course, he's not working in a direct line. He first goes west to, like, Germany, and then he turns south, and then he goes east. So the question, very interesting when we really look at it. I think Tolkien was obviously also being a little bit playful, but he did say that Minas Tirith was based on Ravenna. So there you have it. And if you look up some pictures of Ravenna, you can understand why he felt that way. All right, let's move on to the next question. This next question comes in by the request of my moderator, Dylan of the Darkland, who asks, is the 7 stars of the Crown of Durin the Deathless he first saw in the Lake Miromir related to the 7-star Sickle of Varda threw up in the deeps of time in defiance of Melkor? This is a big sort of maybe, but I'm doubtful, and the dwarves aren't telling. The depiction of 7 stars on the doors of Durin, made by Celebrimbor and Narvi in the Second Age, may be a representation of Durin's crown, or they may be a representation of the Valakirka, the sickle of the Valar, as the door was not just made for dwarves, it was actually made for the elves to enter into Moria. It could also just be a representation of the importance of the number 7 to the dwarvish culture, as there were 7 dwarf lords who were descended from the 7 fathers of the dwarves, one of which was Durin the Deathless himself. 7 stars show up in just about every culture in Middle-earth, and there's no doubt that the Valakirka is also a representation of the real Big Dipper constellation. It's called many things depending on where in Middle-earth you are, so it is possible that Durin's crown, if it is indeed intended to be a constellation, is in fact just their name for the Valakirka. So little of dwarvish culture is shared with outsiders that the elves don't know, and most of the talk about the dwarvish origins in the Silmarillion are just the elves guessing. So you might be wondering why I said if indeed it actually is a constellation, and that's because Durin seeing it was not just looking at his reflection and then noticing the constellation and the reflection in the mirror, and that it looked like a crown on his head. The event was actually a miracle, and Gimli recites a rhyme in The Lord of the Rings that states that as Durin looked down into the mirror, a crown of stars appeared. Some have interpreted this to be that it was during the day, and this makes it even more miraculous. But the real question is, when was this blessed event supposed to have taken place? It is mentioned to be before the fall of both Nargothrond and Gondolin, and it was mentioned to be as Durin, who awoke alone, traveled around and started naming the things that he saw. The suggestion that Durin's crown happened shortly after he awoke is interesting, as the dwarves awoke before men awoke, and before the creation of the sun and the moon. However, Gimli plainly mentions that this happened when no stain yet upon the moon was seen. The event of Gimli bringing Frodo and Sam to Durin's stone, which is the exact location that Durin looked into the water, was absolutely that this happened during the day. And as they looked into the water, they saw glittering stars in the reflection, despite the fact that it was daytime, though it was not said to specifically be Durin's crown. It's the next bit that tells me that the miracle of Durin's crown was probably not a constellation being seen, where Gimli states, "Here lies the crown of Durin till he wakes." This, coupled with Frodo's description of the stars as like jewels sunk in the deep, tells me that it is less likely that Durin saw a reflection, but more likely that he saw a vision in the water itself, a message from the Valar. The fact that there are 7 stars, and that's the same number as the number of stars in the Valakirka, is not as significant as the fact that there were 7 fathers of the dwarves. Remember at this point that Durin was alone. Unlike all of the other fathers, he didn't awaken next to a destined mate, and he was far from any other dwarves. The message may have simply been, there are others, you must build a city here for them. The timey-wimey sort of aspect of it is harder to nail down, but we know that a lot of what the dwarves share with the other races is just obfuscation of their true origins and their cultures. In the case of Gimli, he's eager to share a bit of his culture with Frodo and Sam, who everybody knows Frodo goes somewhere, Sam goes with him. He may just be repeating a rhyme that he knows by heart and possibly believes, but there certainly was no moon in the sky when Durin looked into the Mirror. Now, Tolkien did later have the idea that the trees and the lamps and all of that was just elvish myth, and that the moon and the sun are just as old as the planet itself. But he certainly did not yet have this idea when he wrote The Lord of the Rings. That came later. So it's possible that he saw the miracle during the Years of the Trees, and it, of course, takes a long time to build something like Moria, especially since he needed to first find other dwarves to gather them there and to help them. He wasn't going to be able to build a city on his own. The delving of Moria probably took centuries, and by the time it was, founded, or I should say established, the sun and the moon were probably in the sky at that point. The stain on the moon may have just meant the moon was young, not blemished. It does sort of line up with Tolkien's much later theory that Morgoth's fortress was on the moon, but like I said, that idea came later, and it sort of invalidates a lot of the Silmarillion, which is a thought that Tolkien thought to be very destructive yet necessary at that time. Though he wound up dying before he got very far with those later ideas. I am of the opinion that Gimli, who is very permissive with his culture for a dwarf, especially when hobbits are concerned, he shared a lot. And he gave them a lot to think about, especially Sam, because, Pippin asked him, hey, what did you see? And Sam was sort of deep in contemplation. He couldn't even answer him. So I think the thought that the stars were a reflection is metaphorical, and Gimli knows this, and it is the mirror itself that gives the image. So there you have it. All right, let's move on to the next question. So our next question, shout out to whoever sent this. I didn't, did I write this down? Let me check, actually. I might actually have this written down. I don't have it in front of me in my notes, but I might have written it elsewhere. Let's see. Oh, here we are. Yes, this is from Time Lord Guy. So shout out to Time Lord Guy who asked me this question. In The Hobbit, where did the enchanted stream come from? Was it part of the corruption of Mirkwood, thanks to Sauron, or could it have been the elves who enchanted it to protect their realm? So we're not told this information directly, but I believe we're meant to understand that it is the latter, that it is the doing of the elves to protect their realm. The first clue that the stream was enchanted by the wood elves is just the use of the word enchantment, which is the way that Bjorn described it to Thorin and Bilbo and the rest of them when he was explaining that, you're not likely to find any good drinking water in Mirkwood. The word is not really used ever in conjunction with evil magic. Tolkien would use the word like sorcery or necromancy if that was the case. The second clue is the ferry with the boat being on the opposite side of the shore. So it's like, so that they could use it to cross the river and go the other way, but they don't want people just sort of crossing into their area there. And, you have to keep in mind that Bilbo and everybody, they're not on the main road through Mirkwood. They're on a secret path that was made by the elves. And you could almost think maybe this is the edge of Thranduil's effective domain. He's the king of the Woodland Realm, and he once resided in the south of Mirkwood. But his people had retreated to the north, and they very rarely went to the south. So it is likely that this enchantment was set up to ward off trespassers. The biggest hint, though, is what the enchantment actually does. Bombur falls into the river, and he's just completely zonked out. He's comatose for quite a few while. I think it was a couple of days, which forced the weakened and starving dwarves to carry him. When he eventually wakes up, he describes the dreams that he had, specifically of elves feasting in the woods, presided over by a king with golden hair and a crown of leaves. I don't think that Sauron, or the corruption caused by Sauron or the Witch King, would cause the river to give people dreams about eating at Thranduil's table, the description of the feast and of Thranduil himself matches what they later see. So even later still, Bilbo, he gets zapped by elf magic directly. He doesn't touch enchanted water, he just gets zapped, and he's put out, and he's awakened by Dori because Dori tripped over him, and he describes the same dream that Bombor had. Bilbo had planned on approaching the elves while he was wearing the ring, because he wanted to sort of scout out the situation and see what was up, but the dwarves just sort of pushed him into the clearing before he was ready, and he gets blasted to sleep. And this, of course, was the elves doing, and Bilbo, when he wakes up, he speaks exactly like Bombor. He describes the same dream, and that really annoys Thorin, because dream dinners aren't any good, and you can't share them. Bilbo even reacts the same way that Bombor did. He wants to go back to sleep and return to the dream. So the next time they find a clearing with a feast, we get this following passage. The feast that they now saw was greater and more magnificent than before. And at the head of a long line of feasters he saw a woodland king with a crown of leaves upon his golden hair, very much as Bombor had described the figure in his dream. So this is their first look at Thranduil. And he is absolutely the figure that Bombor described after falling into the Enchanted River. This is all the evidence that I would need to conclusively say that the magic of the Enchanted River is elf magic. It's not a byproduct of Sauron or a byproduct of the Witch King. All right, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in by the request of Bardi Party, who asks, in the Children of he wrote Turin, but it's the Children of Húrin. Sador informs Turin regarding human history. A darkness lies behind us, and out of it few tales have come. The fathers of our fathers may have had things to tell, but they did not tell them. What is Sador referring to? So let's put the quote back into context, and let's attribute it correctly. It wasn't Sador who said this, but it was just mentioned that Sador spoke to Turin in a similar fashion. Let me read you that section here. In the 60th year after the return of the Noldor, ending many years of peace, a great host of orcs came down from Angband, but was utterly defeated and destroyed by the Noldor. That was called Dagor Aglareb, the glorious battle. But the elvish lords took warning from it, and set the siege of Angband, which lasted almost 400 years. It was said that men, whom the elves called Atani the Second, and Hildur the Followers, arose far off in the east of Middle-earth toward the end of the Elder Days. But of their earliest history, the men who entered Beleriand in the days of their long peace, when Angband was besieged and its gates shut, would never speak. The leader of these first men to cross the Blue Mountains was named Beor the Old, and to Finrod Felagund, king of Nargothrond, who first encountered them, Beor declared, a darkness lies behind us, and we have turned our backs on it, and we do not desire to return thither even in thought. Westwards our hearts have been tuned, and we believe that there we shall find the light. Sador, the old servant of Húrin, spoke in the same way to Turin in his boyhood. But it was said afterwards that when Morgoth learned of the arising of men, he left Angband for that last time, and went into the east, and that the first men to enter Beleriand had repented and rebelled against the dark power, and were cruelly hunted and oppressed by those who worshipped it and its servants. So the quote wasn't from Sador, it was from Beor the Old, who said it to Finrod. It is mentioned that Sador spoke in the same way to Turin when he was young, imparting the sort of same lessons, but the quote is not directly from him. As to the meaning of the quote, the end of that second paragraph there, it gives us all the hints we need. The Children of Húrin is one Tolkien story that is the most concerned with the lives and the exploits of mortal men. And as such, it does contain a lot of their history. Men awoke in the eastern lands, and when Morgoth heard rumor of their awakening, he traveled to the east. It isn't said exactly what happened, but the Atani, which in Quenya that would be the Edain, the noble men that first traveled to Beleriand and first came into contact with the elves, they seem to be exiles. They're hunted by those who worshipped it and its servant, referring to the dark power. And the capital letters that are used there, the dark power, It's very similar to what Aragorn says in The Lord of the Rings, the enemy, with capital E, and that's Sauron, or the great enemy, capital G and capital E, when he's talking about Morgoth. So essentially, some of the earliest men were devil worshippers, and Morgoth had them under his sway, but then there were some that refused to worship Morgoth. And they were hunted by those who did, and their hearts yearned for the western lands. So you might wonder why early man was so eager to worship Melkor or Morgoth, or you might even judge them harshly for doing that. But when we examine a later part of the book, the words of Melkor himself when he speaks to Húrin, and of course Húrin's reply, we can understand why. Melkor didn't tell them about the Valar, he didn't tell them about the elves, and he certainly didn't tell them about Ilúvatar, who is God. He called himself God, and he told them that he created the world, and that he's in charge of everything, and that he's the most powerful thing there is, and there's nothing anybody can do about it. So, and there's nothing beyond the world, and there's nothing beyond death except for just oblivion. And some men, wound up thinking, that's probably a lie. It doesn't sound true. And these wound up being the Atani, the Edain, who came into Beleriand. They didn't really want to talk about that because I think part of it, they were ashamed that their kin were worshiping the devil, but also it was just a dark memory for them. It was traumatic. So that's probably why. All right, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in from the request of, and I hope I'm saying this right, Der Eisendrache, who asks, could the Valar create life since they created all of existence with Eru, or is Eru the only one who can? I'm glad you brought this up because this is something that I think people generally get wrong. The Valar not only can they create life, but they demonstratively do this. They do create life in the Silmarillion many, many times over. The oft-repeated only Eru Ilúvatar can create life, it's so untrue that it's not even really funny anymore. The source of this, the cited source for people who say this is the chapter of the Silmarillion of Auli and Yavanna, which is the chapter in the Silmarillion that deals with the creation of the dwarves and the Ents. Auli creates the dwarves, but they're more akin to homunculi than they are to people, until Ilúvatar gives them true life, and they have thoughts and a will of their own. By comparison, the Ents were born out of the mind of Yavanna, but they were actually created by Ilúvatar. Many people have taken this sort of to the extreme to think, well, the Valar just can't create life without Ilúvatar. They need him, and without him, they can only create mindless drones. The truth of it is that the Valar cannot create people that have their own wills. And that's true. But there is so much more to life than people. Plants are life. Animals are life. And all of the plants and all of the animals in Arda were created by the Valar. And, Yavanna herself, she thought of the Ents. Yes, they were created by Eru Ilúvatar, but she thought of them to protect her creation, the trees. Sometimes we get examples of which Vala created which animal or which plant. Like we know that Orma created cattle and he created horses. But a lot of times it's just sort of vague groupings. Yavanna made all the trees and possibly all of the plants that grow on land, but all the life in the sea was the creation of Ulmo. Birds were made by Manwe, and many of the Maiar, in fact, took the form of his beloved birds. So yes, the Valar can create life. They just can't create thinking peoples. Now, the mystery of the orcs, which appear to be thinking peoples, was one that Tolkien wrestled with his entire adult life. And before he died, he was sort of thinking at that point that maybe the orcs were actually animals that were corrupted by necromancy by Melkor, which would explain why they're always evil. But he hadn't definitively settled on that explanation. It was just what was on his mind at the time. And he was constantly changing his mind and wound up dying before he could implement that idea into any story. All right, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in by the request of Broken, who asks, could Lúthien have put Fëanor to sleep like she did Melkor? And now this one was really interesting because Broken asked me this question, but he also asked Sid. And Sid had a very, very different answer, and I'm not going to sit here and say that Sid is wrong and that I'm right, but I'm going to say that in this instance, with an impossible scenario that never would have happened, and sort of a what-if sort of situation, that we're just disagreeing. And Sid has a very good answer that he wrote on Quora that tells you why he thinks, yes, this absolutely could have happened. And I'm going to say why I think no, I don't think it could happen. It's a very complicated issue, but my instinct is really to say no. Not only would Lúthien not be able to put Fëanor to sleep in that fashion, I don't think she would try. Now, if we look at this in terms of just sheer raw power, then, there's no question about it. A lot of people would say, if Lúthien could put Morgoth, who's the most powerful of the Valar, to sleep, then she could put an elf to sleep. However, there's a lot of mitigating factors here. The first is that transitive properties don't work in literature or mythology, or at least they shouldn't work if the literature and the mythology is well constructed. To explain this, if you're saying, well, if A could beat up B and B could beat up C, then that definitely means that A could beat up C. And it's just this sort of cold mathematical property that, first off, isn't the way that Tolkien thought of things. And secondly, it ignores all of the complexities of interactions between characters, such as motivations and situations and venue and timing. It just doesn't work for me. The second thing is that Fëanor and Morgoth are not at all alike. Fëanor was singularly driven towards one goal: the recovery of the Silmarils and the annihilation of anybody who got in his way. His oath was not just this personal grudge that he had, it was a covenant that he made with Eru Ilúvatar, who doesn't appreciate his name being taken in vain, so if you make an oath to him, you have to keep it. Fëanor didn't care who you are, if you're his enemy or his family, if you're a mortal man, you're elf, even one of the Valar. If you were in his way, or you hindered him in any way, or you held one of the Silmarils and didn't just immediately surrender to him when he asks for it, he would attack you. This isn't just a promise, he was compelled to do so, as were his sons, who took the oath foolishly, and even after some of them started to get cold feet and they tried to lay off all the mass murdering, the oath gnawed at them on a spiritual level. This doesn't mean that Fëanor is unstoppable. The Balrogs certainly stopped him in a very permanent way, and not even the likes of Melkor or even Manwë could exit Mandos without the permission of Namo. So someone as powerful as Fëanor and as single-minded as Fëanor could indeed be stopped and contained. But that doesn't mean that he could be stopped and contained in the specific way that Lúthien stopped and contained Morgoth in that story. Lúthien putting Morgoth to sleep was one of the biggest shows of power in the whole Legendarium, aside from like the Akalabeth, and it happened for a single reason. Morgoth let it happen. It wasn't a fight. Morgoth didn't see Lúthien as an enemy. He saw her as an object of lust. And so she entranced him so much that he didn't notice that her magic was making all of his court drop to sleep. And then finally, a blast of concentrated magic put him to sleep. Fëanor was unbothered by lust. He was a married man who didn't mind walking away from his wife when she didn't want to come with him to Middle-earth. And he already had 7 kids. He wasn't going to get the hots for Lúthien in the way that Morgoth did and then be distracted in that specific manner. So to sum it all up, Lúthien was able to put Morgoth to sleep because Morgoth let down his guard, which is something that Fëanor was not going to do. All right, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in by the request of John Scheidner, who asks, if Celebrimbor had not forged the 3 rings, would he or the other elves still have perceived Sauron's deception with just the original 16? Now, we have to sort of like get the disclaimer out of the way here. When you have a tapestry in front of you and you start picking at the threads in the tapestry, it unravels the whole thing and it just destroys the work. For the specific matter of the three rings, Vilya, Narya, Nenya, they did not actually matter in the instance of the elves perceiving Sauron and the One Ring. When the One Ring was created, Sauron became aware of all the rings of power, including the three that were made after he left Eregion, and they were made by Celebrimbor. The elves also became aware of him when he enchanted the One Ring, and hearing his voice through their rings, they took them off. Now, of course, we know that this, how the story goes from there. He realizes the elves are not wearing the rings anymore, and that his plan at this point is a failure. So he storms into Eregion to take back the rings of power. He recovered the 16 that he had already been aware of, but these 3 that he sensed were not there, and Celebrimbor did not relent under torment, and he died, and the knowledge of the location of the 3 died with him. So let's talk about the actual sequence of events from Celebrimbor's perspective. The elves did take off their rings, but that didn't include the 3 because nobody was wearing them yet. We know this because Celebrimbor still had all 3. Nobody was wearing them. So he takes them to Lothlorien, and he asks for Galadriel's advice, and she tells him, you know what, keep those safe, and keep them away from Sauron. And he gives her one of them. He gives her Nenya. And then he brought Narya and Vilya to Lindon, to the High King Gil-galad, and gave them to Gil-galad. And Gil-galad keeps Vilya for himself, and he gives the other one, Narya, to Círdan. And Círdan winds up giving that one to Gandalf, and Gil-galad winds up giving his ring to Elrond. So that's how it all winds up in The Lord of the Rings. Since the 3 were unique, they weren't touched at all by Sauron, and they were made specifically to ward off evil, they were thought to be very good and very useful. But the elves were smart, and they knew that they were still vulnerable to the power of the One Ring. So they weren't using them, they weren't wearing them, they were only keeping them. They were holding on to them. And they only started wearing them much later on when Sauron was defeated, and he was thought gone forever at this point, and the One Ring was thought to be lost forever. So while it's incredibly destructive to the story to erase the 3 rings, they weren't actually on anyone's hand until after Sauron's fall at the end of the Second Age by the hands of Gil-galad and Elendil. Celebrimbor, at that time, he had all 3, but he wasn't wearing them, he wasn't using them at this point. He may have even wound up making more than 3 if Sauron had not showed his hand so early. All right, and now we're going to move on to the last question. Our final question comes in by the request of Rash Terry, who asks, can you elaborate on the second music of the Ainur? It's probably the most confusing element of the Legendarium. What exactly is it? Is it the end of the world, the remaking of it into something new, or transition of it into the real world, or something else? So the second music is this event that hasn't happened yet. And it's Tolkien's version of the sort of the biblical revelation or the Norse Ragnarok, or at least what happens after those things. The idea is that, in the Ainur Lindala, which translates as Music of the Holy Ones, Iluvatar, which is God, he has the Ainur, they're the angels. He leads them in this 3-part, concert with themes being the creation of the universe and everything in it. There was improvisation by the angels on his themes, and that's how the thoughts of each individual angel wound up being in creation. The most alluded to being, Yavanna thinking about, hey, I'm going to need something to protect the trees that I'm going to create, and then Iluvatar heard her voice, and he creates the Ents. So he heard her voice, and he created them when he made the universe. Most of the improv was very welcome like that, but then there was Melkor. Melkor is sort of like Satan, and he sang themes discordant to God's, and thus he created the concept of evil. So the world, which is called Arda, which is the Elvish word for earth, is marred. So Tolkien once wrote that we're living in like the 6th or 7th age, or at least at that time we were like in either the late 6th or early 7th age, which is far beyond the story of the Lord of the Rings, which is the end of the 3rd age and the very beginning of the 4th age. He never elaborated much on how long these ages would be. They were marked by the falls of great evil, Morgoth, and then Sauron again. However, the thought is that we're still living in Arda Mard. Eventually, the world will end because the music ends. It reaches its conclusion, and a conclusion that's only known to Iluvatar, as he veiled the ending to the Ainur when he showed them the vision of the universe playing out. Tolkien had this idea that there was going to be a final battle called the Dagor Dagorath, which is the Battle of Battles, in which Melkor would return and be battled by Eärendil and Tulkas and Eanwa and the returned spirit of Turin Turambar, he keeps coming up today, who would be the one who would finally slay Melkor. And then, because Melkor, he's one of the Valar, in fact, he's the greatest of them, and he put a lot of himself into the world, so he couldn't be destroyed without the world itself being destroyed. So the final destruction of Melkor would mean the final destruction of the world itself and the death of everybody, including the elves. So Tolkien, he didn't keep that. He abandoned the idea of the final battle, but he still held on to this idea that the world is finite, and because the music is finite. And eventually, the world will end, and it will be reborn. And then he's going to take a second crack at it, and this time, no Melkor. And he would welcome the voices of his children, the elves and the men, and even the dwarves, in creating Arda Unmarred, which is a world without evil. And so you could say this hasn't happened yet because we still have evil in the world. Anyway, that was our last question, but we have quiz results to go over, so let's go ahead and go over the quiz results. All right, so I have the quiz results here. I'm actually looking at them on my phone here, so I'll be editing this tomorrow for me, so when I say the percentages, they might be slightly off, but they'll pretty much be, pretty much the same, I think. Okay, so our first quiz question here is, which reason did Christopher Plummer give for turning down the role of Gandalf in Peter Jackson's The Lord of the Rings? So the 4 answers I gave you were: the long filming schedule interfered with his travel plans, he did not understand the script, he thought the script was subpar, and he did not think the film would be a hit. So as you can see here, pretty even spread. Almost nobody, only 3% went for the script was subpar, which was actually what was Patrick Stewart's reason for turning down Gandalf. He didn't like the script. 32% of you went for he didn't understand the script, which is actually Sean Connery's reason for turning down Gandalf. He did not think the film would be a hit, was 31%. Actually, no actor said that. So that was one that I completely made up. The truth, of course, which 33% of you gave, a small plurality, was the long filming schedule interfered with his travel plans. He would have been stuck in New Zealand for quite a few years, actually, and he was getting on in years, and he was like, I'm sort of at the end of my life, and I want to travel the world. Sort of bittersweet for me personally, because I always thought Christopher Plummer was like the pick for Gandalf, other than maybe Max von Sydow. Those were the two that I saw as Gandalf. But of course we got Ian McKellen, and he was wonderful, so we can't argue there. Our second quiz here: how many granddaughters did Finwë have that we know of? So 0, 1, 2, and 3. 12% of you said he didn't have any granddaughters. 32% of you said he had 1. 33% of you said he had 2 granddaughters, which is the correct answer. And 23% of you said he had 3. Now, keep in mind, these are 2 that we know of. We're talking about Arathel and Galadriel. He probably has more granddaughters that were born in the Undying Lands that we just aren't told about. But these are the 2 that we absolutely know about. Okay, our next one here, which of these Tolkien-inspired items is not found in a Castlevania game? We talked about this a few times on streams. There's a lot of Tolkien stuff in Castlevania games. which actually started with a sword called the Chrysagram, which is Chrysagram was a mountain range in Beleriand, which is where Gondolin was in, the circular mountain range. The middle of that was Gondolin, and that was a sword in the Japanese version of Castlevania Symphony of the Night, and then it was translated by a bunch of huge nerds like me who saw, hey, there's a Tolkien thing in here, let's put a whole bunch of other Tolkien things in here, and then there were more in later games as well. So 16% of you said Gurthang, 21% of you said the Ring of Varda, 24% of you said the Fist of Tulkas, 39% of you, a plurality, got it right, Anduril. Aragorn's sword does not show up in Castlevania, but there are a bunch of other Tolkien-inspired names. There's Mormigel, which means black sword, which alludes to Turin Turambar. There's the Chrysagram I mentioned, or Christ, the sword of Hador, Mablung sword, Glamdring, the ice sword of Mim. We talked about Mim earlier. And there's Narsil, but it's misspelled as Marsil, and the Naglamir is also in there, the necklace of the dwarves. So a lot of them are in there. Okay, next one. Which of these did Tolkien claim that Tom Bombadil was? So let's see. So 19% of you said the most powerful being in Middle-earth. 23% of you got it right, which was that he was a representation of natural science. 15% said that he was Tolkien's self-insert. And 43% of you, the big plurality here, said that Tolkien never spoke about Bombadil. But if you read his letters, you could see that he did talk about Bombadil. Not a whole lot, but he did write some pretty long letters about who Bombadil is and what he represents and what he's all about. And the origin, too. The whole idea of John Tolkien flushing a doll down the toilet. All right, here's the next one. Oh, this one, I tricked so many of you with this. What is Aeglos? 59% of you went for the very first thing, the spear that Gil-galad uses in his battle against Sauron. That's absolutely true. However, you need to read all of the options because we also have a spiny yellow flower that grew in Beleriand, which 8% of you voted for that. The name of a yearly journal of a Polish Tolkien society, 3% of you went for that. And all the above, which is the correct answer. All of those are called Aeglos, and only 30% of you, just about half of the people that went for the obvious one. I put that at the top for a reason. I did kind of get you guys there. All right, here's the next one. Which day of the week did hobbits have evening feasts? So we have Stir Day, Heaven's Day, True's Day, and High Day. In this case, 45% of you, a really good plurality, got it right that it's High Day. 17% went for Stir Day, 22% for Heaven's Day, and 17% for True's Day. So High Day is actually Friday, and that's it was adapted from the Númenórean day, which was called Urbaline, which was dedicated to the Valar. The hobbits, of course, celebrated every High Day with feasts in the evening, and after the calendar was changed, they actually made sure that all of their holidays were on a High Day as well. Okay, and this is our last one. What is the origin of the song "The Man in the Moon Stayed Up Too Late," which Frodo sang in The Prancing Pony? So 16% of you said that Frodo made it up on the spot, which is not true. 13% of you said it was translated from an Elvish tale, also not true. A good majority here, 65% of you got it right, that it was written by his cousin Bilbo. And then 5% of you, I thought more people might go for this, but 5% of you said that it was inspired by a legend from Gondor. And that is actually sort of a second poem, which you can find in the Adventures of Tom Bombadil, which is called "The Man in the Moon Came Down Too Soon," which is actually adapted from a legend from Gondor. But that one, "The Man in the Moon Stayed Up Too Late," which actually is really interesting when you read it, if you know the Silmarillion and the lore and everything. It's really interesting, the allusions to Tilion, the Maya, and everything. But that's the one that Bilbo wrote, and he probably wrote it because he knew a lot of Elvish lore, and he wanted to adapt it into sort of Hobbitish lore. And you see this with some of his other poems, like Errantry, which is sort of a take on Eärendil. You know, but anyway, that's the video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I hope you guys enjoyed it more than I did, because like I said, I'm feeling like I'm in a lot of pain today. Just like I said, just an upset stomach. Thankfully, it's nothing like gross or anything like that, but it's just sort of like, painful right now. But I did enjoy talking to you guys about Tolkien and reading for you and answering your questions. I just hope that you are not in pain when you're watching the video. I will see you guys next week. Like the video, hype the video, share the video, comment on the video, even if it's just to say hi. Even if you're just saying, hey there, hi, I'm here. comment on the video. This is all very important. Subscribe if you haven't subscribed already. And if you want to support me in a greater fashion, consider membership. Membership does not cost a lot. It's only $5 a month. And you get all sorts of perks, especially the biggest perk being you get to see all the videos early, at least a week early. I'll see you guys next time.